Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is a Siyum on Sefer Shemoth in the Machon Shilo Triennial Cycle. Baruch Hashem, we began learning according to a triennial cycle with Sefer Shemoth roughly 9 months ago. And Baruch Hashem, we just finished this past week, and we'll be starting Vayikra this week. Briefly, what is the triennial cycle for those who are not familiar? It is the original practice of reading, laning the Chumash, the Torah, in roughly 3.5 years. It was the original practice of Eretz Israel. What is the Machon Shilo triennial cycle? Well, that is a cycle that a learning cycle that we've put together, that Gabriel, who's with us, put together, enabling us to learn according to that original practice. So I'm very grateful to Gabriel for putting together the calendar and doing the scholarly work behind the cycle. I hope that Im Yirtzeh Hashem one day we'll have a shul that reads according to the cycle, but for now we're on Zoom. So it's not going to be quite a traditional Siyum, but what we do have is Kavod Harav David Bar-Hayim speaking in a second for us, and then afterwards Gabriel will say a few words to encourage us all to participate in Vayikra. So Birshut Harav, thank you for joining us, and we'd be grateful if the Rav would share some words with us.
Shalom uvracha. I was asked to speak tonight in English, and generally, or at least some of the time, I do what I'm told, so it will be in English. Even though I always prefer to speak Divrei Torah b'Lashon HaKodesh, that is the natural medium for studying and discussing Torah. But as we are about to discuss in this brief shiur this evening, Targum, translating the Torah, making it understandable, comprehensible to people who do not fully understand Lashon HaKodesh, and as I will explain in a moment, that includes all of us, without exception, I think. I certainly can speak for myself. Translating the Torah, making it accessible to all, both in past generations and Kal Vachomer ben Beno shel Kal Vachomer in this generation, is also an essential part of the Torah. The Torah was given b'Lashon HaKodesh. That is our language. That is the holy tongue. It is unique in every way, profound and deep, far beyond what most people are aware of or able to grasp even. But we also speak other languages, many of us do, and even for those who do not speak other languages, those who speak only Hebrew, they too must understand that the truth of the matter is that all of us require a Targum. All of us require a translation of the Torah, even if it's into Hebrew. Because the Lashon, the language of the Torah, and of the Nevi'im, of course, and the Tanakh in general, the Ketuvim, the language of the Torah, and the same can also be said to a different degree with regards to the Lashon of the Chachamim, in the Mishnah, for example. The Lashon of the Torah is not identical to the Lashon that we speak today. That is not to say, I'm not presenting here a Satmar point of view that Ivrit Meduberet, spoken Hebrew today, or Ivrit Modernit, is not Hebrew. It is Hebrew. I'm not referring, of course, to the words like Ki'ilu and Sababa, v'chule v'chule. Excuse me. I'm not referring to that kind of Hebrew, which is unfortunately all too common, but proper Hebrew as spoken today is a very wonderful language, also very important. And Baruch Hashem that we we are zocheh to live in a time when Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew language, is a living language, even though it is being abused and distorted by many, true, but Baruch Hashem, we live in this time, and we have such Lashon at our disposal, and many of us speak it on a daily basis. Nevertheless, we all have to understand, including born and bred Israelis, that the Hebrew that we understand, or the way we understand many words, many shorashim, many of the roots in Hebrew, many of the usages, as they appear in the Torah, are not what we would expect. And therefore, to understand the Torah, we all require a Targum. And an essential part of the Triennial Cycle, which is more correctly a 3.5-year cycle, more or less, although it's not rigid, it can be adjusted up or down, but that's roughly what we're talking about, as it appears in Masechet Soferim. The Triennial Cycle, one of the purposes of studying the Torah Shebichtav in this fashion, is to allow us to actually understand what we're reading, what we're learning. We all know that many people, those who want to learn Torah and wish to study the Mefarshim on the Torah, many people discover that there is a problem. They have a problem, namely that every year they start again from Sefer, from Parashat Bereshit, as was done in shuls everywhere just yesterday, and they study the first few Rashis and maybe the first Ramban and maybe a couple of other Mefarshim on the beginning of the parasha, and maybe they get as far as Sheni or Shalishi or Afilu HaMithhasdim v'HaMathmidim, the greater amongst the learners amongst us, maybe make it as far as Revi'i, but very few people are able to actually go through the parasha with even a smattering of the Mefarshim and really understand and internalize what they are reading, and to fully understand the various usages, the various words that we come across, without spending quite some time on it and looking at the most authoritative and ancient sources. To understand the Torah as it is written before us is really beyond our capabilities, without taking advantage of those ancient sources. And the most ancient source that we have on the Torah, the most ancient perush that we have on the Torah before us today, is Targum Onkelos in Aramaic. Targum Onkelos, of course, was written in Aramaic because most of the Jewish people, certainly those in Eretz Yisrael and those in Bavel, spoke on a daily basis, spoke one or another dialect of Aramaic, of Aramith. Hebrew was not the common language, the spoken language, the vernacular of most Jews. It was really the Lashon of the Hachamim. And this is also why it became known as Lashon HaKodesh. In the Tanakh, for example, there is no reference to the Hebrew language as Lashon HaKodesh. In the Tanakh, Lashon HaKodesh is referred to as either Lashon Kena'an or Yehudith, the language of the people of Yehuda. That is what we find in the Tanakh. It is never referred to in the Tanakh as Lashon HaKodesh. It became Lashon HaKodesh because when Jews returned initially in very small numbers, few Jews returned initially to Eretz Yisrael from the Galuth at the beginning of Beit Sheni. The Hachamim amongst them, of course, knew Hebrew, and they made a tremendous effort to retain that language as a living language, at least amongst the learned, at least amongst the Hachamim. So they taught their Talmidim in Hebrew. The Mishnah was in Hebrew. And it was therefore the language of the Hachamim and of the holy texts and of the Tefillah, right? Tefillah and the Beth Knesset, but Tefillah Berabim, Tefillah HaSibur is only to be done in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew. An individual who does not understand, shall we say, the Shemoneh Esrei in Hebrew may recite the Shemoneh Esrei and also Shema in other languages that he understands. But in the Beth Knesset, as a tefillah of the Sibur, it has to be in Lashon HaKodesh. It has to be in Hebrew. And that is why it became known as Lashon HaKodesh, because it became the holy tongue. In other words, here we're going full circle. We're returning to the ta'ana of the Hasidei Satmar. And in fact, the Revmi Satmar. In other words, their complaint against the reviving of Hebrew as a spoken language was that it's supposed to be Lashon HaKodesh. It's supposed to be in the Beit Knesset. It's supposed to be for learning Torah. It's not supposed to be a spoken language. And it is a fact. That was the reality for a very, very long time, for many, many generations. But clearly, before Hurban Bayit Rishon, or up to that point, it was the spoken language. It was the day-to-day vernacular of the people in Eretz Israel. First of all, earlier, until the northern kingdom was destroyed by Sanheriv around roughly 2,700 years ago, and later in Eretz Yehuda, Mamlechet Yehuda, it was the spoken language, and it was referred to as Yehudith. This is what people spoke. So the claim that Hebrew should not be spoken on a daily basis when discussing how much your purchases in the Makoleth should come to and how much you should pay, the claim that that should not be said in Hebrew is not true. It is not a Torah concept. But it is certainly true that at the beginning of Beit Sheni, after the Jews had spent 70 odd years in Galuth, and had essentially, most of them had forgotten their ancestral language and had adopted the language of their surroundings, as is normal, as happens again and again throughout history, both to the Jewish people and to all people who are exiled and find themselves in a foreign land and are a minority amongst in a sea of other people and other languages and another different culture. The Jews lost their language except for the elite, except for the Leviim and their Talmidim. And their Talmidim and Talmidim were the Hachamim and Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and they retained this language, and they were very insistent and made every possible effort that Lashon HaKodesh not be forgotten. And that is why as we said, the Mishnah was taught in Hebrew, and the study of Torah was to some extent at least done in Hebrew. That is why we see the Baraitot are in Hebrew. We even see in Masechet Rosh Hashanah and the Talmud Bavli that there were even simple people, even in the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which is much later. In other words, we're talking about, shall we say, 180 odd years after year 180, Leminyan HaUmoth. At that time, there were still some common people who spoke Hebrew as their vernacular. Apparently, they were already a small minority. It was not the majority, but we see this because it states there in the Talmud Bavli that the some Talmidim of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, did not understand a certain pasuk in the Nevi'im where it uses the term metateh. The word or the shoresh of the word being used there is metateh, which is a broom, and they didn't understand the pasuk. But then they heard the shifha, the servant girl in Rabbi's home, use that word when she was cleaning the house with a broom, and they heard the word matopeh, and they understood what this pasuk now meant, what it was referring to. So there were apparently people, even at that time, and probably even sometime later, who these are probably in small villages, remote places, not in the cities, but in rural areas. There were some people who retained the language even much later, but essentially became the language of the Chachamim. So, as we said, we all require a Targum. And one of the major ideas behind reviving this ancient practice of a triennial cycle of studying the Torah has to do with placing much more emphasis and allowing us the time and the ability, the possibility of focusing on the Targum in order to essentially revive the Targum and save it from oblivion. As we all know, the only Jews left in the world today who read the Targum every Shabbat, and this is even by today, it's not even the case in every single Temani shul, but in most Temani, most Yemenite shuls, it is the case that they read the Targum. And this is something that even your average, not very learned Temani Jew is familiar with from a young age. And therefore it is not a foreign language. It's not something they don't understand. At least they understand it, at least partially. And the more learned amongst them understand it extremely well. The one way to ensure that you will not know something, or that your children will not know it, is not to use it. If you want your child to speak English, you have to speak English to them. If you want them to know Hebrew, then they have to speak Hebrew, have to have experience of speaking Hebrew. The same is true with the Targum. If you don't use it, as the expression goes, it's use it or lose it. If you don't study the Targum, you're not familiar with this language, then it will be forgotten. And not only will it be forgotten, the actual text will become corrupt because no one bothers to actually correct it and make sure that it's proper and as it should be. And the text therefore becomes more and more corrupt. The more a text is used, the less it will be corrupted. The less it is used, the more it will be corrupted. And therefore we are very lucky in our generation to have the Temani manuscripts, Yemenite manuscripts of Targum Onkelos on the Torah and Targum Yonathan on the Nevi'im, which are not the same, not written by the same person and not from exactly the same period. But these two ancient Targumim were maintained by the Temanim, and they were learned and studied by the Temanim on a regular basis. As they read the Torah with the Targum of Onkelos, so they read the Haftarah with the Targum of Yonathan ben Oziel. And thus, these remain living and meaningful texts. And we are lucky to live in a time where we can, all of Am Yisrael today, can benefit from the fact that the Temanim, like all other Jews, did not give up on the Targumim. All right, so having made those initial comments, let us look for a moment at what it says in the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Merila, Daf Gimel. Masechet Merila, Daf Gimel, Amud Aleph in the Talmud Bavli. Line 6. V'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'itema Rabbi Hiya bar Abba. Targum shel Torah, Onkelos hager amaro. The first thing to understand about this statement is that it says the Targum of the Torah. We're talking only about the Torah here, not the Nevi'im and not the Ketuvim. The Targum of the Torah, Onkelos hager, is the person who composed it, was a ger tzedek by the name of Onkelos. Amaro. It doesn't say Kethavo, it says Amaro. Amaro means it was not written down, it was not committed to writing. In other words, and Shadal, Chacham Shadal talks about this in his unique book, his Perush, and his statements and comments and remarks on the Targum of Onkelos called Ohev Ger. And I'm more than happy, by the way, to send a copy of a file that I have prepared for printing by Yonathan Bassi, on called Ohev, the whole Sefer called Ohev Ger on the Targumim, mainly on the Targum Onkelos on the Torah, but also some remarks with regards to the Targum on Ketuvim, etc., which is a different discussion. The Targumim on the Ketuvim are later and a different matter altogether, as we will see in a moment in Rashi. So it says here, Targum Shilo, Torah, Onkelos Hager Amaro, not Ketavo, Amaro. It was Baal Peh. It was an essential part of the Torah Baal Peh. Just like the Mishnah was not written down, and later the Talmud was not written down until much later, as Rashi states elsewhere, as we will discuss in a moment. And it goes on to say, Mipi, that he composed this Targum, Mipi Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Yoshua. Now the words Mipi Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Yoshua would seem, one would think, to imply that it was given over to him by Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. In which case, the Shadal points out in his book that I mentioned, Ohev Ger, that it should say that the Targum is from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Why is Onkelos mentioned here at all? And Shadal mentions another Gemara, which is in Masechet Avodah Zarah, the Talmud Bavli, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Towards the bottom of the Daf, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph in Avodah Zarah, the Talmud Bavli, it says here, Sorefim al hamalachim, wa'en bo mishum darchei ha'emori. In other words, when a king of the Jewish people dies, we burn his belongings as a sign of mourning, and because no one else is permitted to benefit and use those belongings. And this is not considered an improper practice. En bo mishum darchei ha'emori. And then it goes on to say, this is 7-8 lines from the bottom of the daf. Uchashem shesorofim al hamalachim, as this is the custom, and there is a proper custom with regards to kings. Kach sorofim al hanesiim. The same is true also of the nesiim, the heads of the Jewish people, when the Jewish people were no longer sovereign, but they had a kind of substitute for the Melucha, which was the Nesiuth. They were also Mibeth Dovid. They were descendants they were connected to Beth Dovid, and they were the heads of the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael. So it is also the practice, Kach Sorofim al Hanesiim, Umahim Sorofim, and what is burnt, Mitatham Uchlei Tashmisham, etc. And then it goes on to say, in other words, there are various belongings, personal effects, their furniture, etc. These things cannot be used by others, and it is a sign of mourning, and it is a proper custom. And then it goes on to say, Uma'aseh Shemet Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, when Rabban Gamliel Hazaken died, وصرف على Onkelos Hager 70 mana thori. Onkelos Hager set on fire, committed to the flames, belongings and various effects of Rabban Gamliel, which were very, very expensive, worth 70 maneh, 70 pieces of silver. why does Shadal mention this Gemara? He wants to show from here that Onkelos Hager was not in fact a Talmid of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. He was actually a Talmid of Rabban Gamliel Zaken, and probably of his son, Rabban Shimon. And that is why he did this. This is why he was there at that time. So he was actually from a somewhat earlier time. He was from a previous generation. In other words, yes, they lived at the same time. Onkelos Hager was in contact with and did know personally Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, but he was not their direct Talmidim. So the Targum is not from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. It is from Onkelos, who was a ger, and of Roman extraction, as is mentioned in Chazal also. We have two versions, by the way. Who exactly were his, from which Roman family did he hail? He was apparently from an aristocratic Roman family, and there was apparently at this time there was a phenomenon at this time of quite a number of Romans, particularly aristocratic Romans, converting. So according to one version, he was connected to the Emperor Hadrian. This appears in Midrash Tanhuma, Parashat Mishpatim. But in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Gitin, Daf Nun Waw Amud Bet, it states that he was the nephew of Titus, of Titus, and this is borne out by all the manuscripts of the Gemara there in Gitin, despite the fact that the Gra wishes to change the Girsa as it appears in the Tanhuma. So we know something of his origins, and we see from this statement in the Talmud in Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Aleph, it seems that he was a Talmid of Rabban Gamliel Zaken. So what does it mean in that case when it states in Masechet Megillah Daf Gimel that Targum Shel Torah Onkelos Hager Amaro Mipi Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua? So Chacham Shadal explains that this means to say that we're talking about a time apparently 20 to 30 years before the Khurban. From what we can estimate, so writes Shadal in his introduction to Ohev Ger, we're talking about the period approximately Lefi Haminyan Shelanu 3,800, which is about 20 or 30 years before Churban Bayit Sheni. And based on these facts, he also points out that we're not talking about the same person mentioned elsewhere in the Talmud. But that's another discussion. So Onkelos Hager wrote this Targum. For what reason? This too, Shadal states very clearly, but he bases himself on Rashi. So let us read first what Rashi says. Rashi says, in Masechet Megillah, the Talmud Bavli Daf Kaf Aleph Amud Bet, the top of the daf more or less. Here, the Talmud Kaf Aleph Amud Bet in the Talmud Bavli Masechet Megillah, the Mishnah on Daf Kaf Aleph states, Hakorev HaMegillah Omed V'Yoshev, which means that he who reads the Megillah, even for the Tzibur, for the public, may do so either standing or sitting, not as opposed to reading the Torah, which has to be done when standing. As opposed to the Torah, where only one person reads the pasuk from the Torah, two people together do not read it, as it were, as a kind of choir. But in the case of the Mechila, two people may read it together. Then it goes on to say, at the beginning of Kaf Aleph Amud Beth, Tenora Banan, it was taught in the Baraitha, but Torah, Ahad Koreh, Ahad Methargem. When it comes to reading from the Torah, one person reads the pasuk and one person reads the Targum. This is the very top of Kaf Aleph Amud Beth. Tenora Banan, but Torah, Ahad Koreh, Ahad Methargem. ובלבד שלא יהיה אחד קורא ושניים מתרגמים. As Rashi explains, וכל שכן שאין שניים קוראים, ומטעמה משום דתרי קלה לא משתמע. Because when two people speak together at the same time, even though they are reciting the same words, we all know that you hear those words less distinctly than when one person recites those words without any other voice or sound being heard. This concept of two sounds cannot be heard distinctly and clearly comes from Masechet Rosh Hashanah with regards to Tekiyat Shofar. But Rashi says this is also the reason why we don't want more than one person reading either from the Torah or from the Targum. The Baraitha continues, Uva Navi, when it comes to reading the Haftarah from the Nevi'im, Ahad Koreh, Ushnai Metargamim. Here it is possible for two people to read the Targum. One person reads the Pasuk from the Navi. There we do not allow more than one person to read. But the Targum may be written, but may be recited by two people or even more. Here Rashi says, this is the second dibur of Rashi on this Amud. Uvanavi afilo had koreh ushnai metargemim. Rashi says shahat targum eno ela lahashmi'a lanashim u'amei haaretz. The purpose of the Targum is only or simply or in the main to so that women who usually do not understand the Hebrew of the Torah, even less likely that your average woman would understand the Lashon of the Torah than your average man, and there were plenty of men who didn't understand as well. And Amei Aretz, as Rashi says, these are referring to the men also who didn't understand. She'enam makirim b'lashon hakodesh, v'hatargum hu la'az habavliim. The Targum is the language of the Bavliim. And why do we make this distinction between Torah and Nevi'im when it comes to how many people may read the Targum simultaneously? When it comes to reading the Torah in public, which is really an act, the purpose of which is a public study of Torah, so that when people hear the miswot in the Torah, they will understand what it is they are reading, what they are hearing, and what they must therefore do. So we must ensure that they hear it clearly and precisely. So one person reads, and one person reads it and reads the Targum also, the Targum, so they will so more people will understand what is being read. Aval b'shel Nevi'im, says Rashi, when it comes to the Nevi'im, la kapadeh alayho kulehai. We are not so concerned that they won't understand exactly, because it's not a question of knowing what the mitzvah of the Torah is, what is permissible, what is asur, when to do this and when not to do that. The Nevi'im are talking about either describing events of their time or describing future times. And if an Am Haaretz doesn't understand precisely what Yeshayahu is relating and predicting and describing that will take place in the future time, or even if he doesn't understand fully the Tochahoth of Yirmiyahu to the people of his generation, that just before the Churban of Bayit Rishon, well, it's not good, but it's not the end of the world either. So we don't have to be quite so concerned. So from this Rashi we see the Targum is written in the first instance for those who don't understand. And the Shadal, as I said, the truth is, certainly today, we are all of us in that position. We do not understand the Lashon of the Torah as we should, as it was intended, as it was understood in earlier times and by the learned people, at least in earlier times. Shadal goes on to explain that Onkelos, who was a ger, as we said, and we also mentioned there were many gerim at that time, he saw that the Torah which was being translated, there was a Targum in existence that was being recited. It wasn't written down, and it was not uniform. In every Beth Knesset, there could be a different Metargem, who, according to his understanding and his Chokhmah and his level and his facility with the language, he would translate the psukim of the Torah as they were being read by the Koreh, the person reading from the Torah. He would explain to the best of his ability. Obviously, you wouldn't take an unlearned person to do this, an unschooled person. You would find the most schooled, the most learned individual in the Beth Knesset to do this. And yet, not in every community, not in every Beth Knesset do you have the ideal person for this task. And there were clearly differences between the way the Torah was being explained to the simple people and to the gerim. Onkelos was particularly aware of the situation and the reality of the gerim in his time. He was one of those gerim. He saw that the Torah was misunderstood and misinterpreted and misrepresented by many of these targumim that people were reciting. Again, there was no text. It was something that was said ba'al peh. And his Targum was also not written initially, was not committed to writing it initially. But he saw that there was a great need for a more authoritative, more precise, and in fact, as we will see, very profound Targum, both for many of the Jews and certainly for the Gerim. And so that, and again, this makes a lot of sense if you understand, again, as we said a moment ago, if Onkelos came from an aristocratic Roman family, he no doubt was aware, and we are aware today from various texts, Roman texts and others, that and our own sources, that there was no shortage of goyim who would ridicule the Torah and the Jews and their beliefs and their Torah. And it was very crucial in his mind that the Torah be translated in such a way that at least the Jews would not be providing ammunition to their enemies and those who ridiculed them and their Torah. So he wanted to provide the most accurate, the most precise translation and rendition of the Torah that could possibly be done. And therefore, Shadal explains that what it says in Mechila Daf Gimel, that he composed orally this Targum, Mipi Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua, it means to say that they heard his Targum, and they agreed that it was very, very unique and worthy of being placed above all other attempts to translate the Torah, and it basically became the standard. It was authorized. It's not like we have an authorized Bible, the authorized version of the Bible. So this was the authorized version of the Aramaic text, Aramaic translation of the Torah. So it was given. Basically, we're talking about a haskama. Today we would say he received the haskama from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Not that they wrote it, not that they handed it over to him, as it were, or placed the words in his mouth, because then, as Shadal says, it would have simply been called the Targum of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. But rather, they were the leading hachamim of that time. We're talking about the generation before the Khurban, one generation, 20, 30 years before the Khurban. They were the two greatest Hachamim. Rabban Gamliel HaZaken was no longer with them, even though he had learned from Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, apparently. And he received their haskama and their encouragement. That is what we see in the Talmud Bavli. It should also be pointed out that in the Talmud Yerushalmi we find another statement. This is to be found in Masechet Megillah in the first perek, in Halacha Het or Halacha Tet. In most books would be Halacha Tet. It's on the Mishnah, which states, the Mishnah begins to say, En ben sefarim letfilin umezuzot, ela shesefarim nichtavim b'chol lashon, utfilin umezuzot enan nichtavot ela ashurit. So it speaks here about the possibility of writing the various books of the Tanakh and also tefillin and mezuzot in languages other than, and in text and in scripts other than Hebrew, except for the fact that tefillin and mezuzot have to be written in Hebrew and in Ashurit, in Hebrew text and Hebrew script, whereas other books of the Tanakh, which are not used as a miswah, like not for the purpose of the miswah of mezuzah or tefillin, but for learning, for study, those books may be written in other languages. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer af bisfarim lo hitiru sheyikotavu ela yavani. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, not in every language, only in Greek. The only language that was permitted by the Hachamim, other than Hebrew, was Greek. That's the Mishnah. Then it goes on to say, at the end of this halakha, basically, later on, at the end, halfway through, it goes on to say, Taneh, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, af b'sfarim lo hitiru sheyikotavu ela yavanit. That's the quote from the Mishnah. Yerushalmi adds, "Ba'deku u'masa'u she'en Torah yochola lehitargem kol sorka ela yavanit." It was looked into and examined, this question of into what languages can one translate the books of the Tanakh, and it was discovered that this can only be done adequately in Greek. Only Greek lends itself to such a translation. In other words, only the Greek was seen as being a language that could in some way convey the meanings and concepts that appear in the original Hebrew text. Goes on to say in the Yerushalmi, Burgani ahad bidalahem aramith mitoch yavanith. There are those who say that instead of yavanith, it should, when it says here aramith, it really refers to Latin, a Roman translation of the Torah. Rabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Rabbi Hiya Bar-Ba. This is the very same Chacham mentioned in the Talmud Bavli. You will note there also was Rabbi Yirmiyah in the name of Rabbi Hiya Bar-Abba. Here it says Bar-Ba. It's the same thing. Tirgem Achilas. Here it's written with an ayin and a chof. Tirgem Achilas Hager HaTorah Lifnei Rabbi Eliezer Lifnei Rabbi Yehoshua. Wachilasu Otho Wa'amaru lo Yaf Yafeta Mi Bnei Adam. So here we have Masorah, that there was a Targum written in Greek, and that is why they praised him and used the term Yaf Yafita Mibnei Adam, referring to the famous pasuk Yaft Elohim liyafet v'yishkon b'ohalei Shem. They praised this Targum, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yehoshua, written by someone called Achilas Hager. So he was also a ger, and apparently it was not Aramaic, it was Greek. So here the question arises: do we know of such a translation of the Torah into Greek that was written by someone called Onkelos, or is it the same person known elsewhere as Onkelos? Is this the same person? And therefore we would have to conclude that this one ger wrote two Targumim, one in Aramaic and one in Greek, which, by the way, I do not consider far-fetched at all, because these were the two major languages that Jews throughout the world and non-Jews who came into contact with Jews or who wished to convert or had converted to Judaism, these are the two languages that people spoke, either Aramaic or Greek. As we know, these were the vernaculars. These were the two international languages, at least in the Roman Empire. These were the two major languages, even more than Latin. So it is possible. There are those who say it's a different individual, different person. It's not the same individual at all. He also happened to be a ger, and this is a different Targum. That's possible. It's also possible that it's the same person, and the name Onkelos and Onkelos is the same name. The Onkelos is the more Bavli, somewhat bastardized form of the name, and it's actually referring to the same person. Either way, we see that at this time, the time of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, which is, again, a generation before the Hurban, roughly, before Hurban Beit Sheni, so we're talking about the middle of the first century, Leminyan HaUmoth, there were apparently these two Targumim that existed already at this time. So this also allows us to appreciate how ancient and how authoritative this translation must be, either one of them or both of them. Whether we have the Greek translation being referred to in the Yerushalmi, whether we have that before us today or not, is moot. Or it seems likely that we did not have that translation, or it was somehow subsumed into the Vulgata, into the Latin translation, which came a bit later, which was probably based on the Greek translation of this Onkelos Hager, and that is what is being referred to in Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, Burghani Ahad Bidalahem Aramith, and as I said, some explain that this is just a code word for Latin. They didn't want to use the word Romith or Latinith. They used Aramith, in other words, the language of the Goyim. Mitoch Yevanith, in other words, here it refers explicitly to one translation being based on a previous translation, not based on the original. In other words, that the Roman translation being referred to, the Latin translation, was not translated directly from the Hebrew, but from a Greek translation. I see that the question is being asked, why was the Targum HaShiv'im, the Septuagint, considered not a very positive event? Well, that's a very interesting discussion in itself. We won't go into that right now, but we're also talking about a different period of time. We're talking about events that are separated by something like 300 plus years, and many things had changed in the world in the interim. So, based on these sources, it seems that the Targum Onkelos that we have before us was given a gushpanka, was given a seal of approval, a haskama, by the greatest Chachamim of that time, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. It became the standard Targum, not the only Targum, but the most authoritative Targum. In Bavel, it became essentially the only Targum. In Eretz Yisrael, we know there were other Targumim as well. There is the Targum Arami of the Torah, which is attributed to Yonatan ben Uziel, but is certainly not from Yonatan ben Uziel. That's another discussion. But there were other Targumim. There's something called the Targum Yerushalmi also, which is similar to the Targum Yonatan, what's miyuchas, what's attributed incorrectly to Yonatan ben Uziel. In other words, these are Targumim of the Torah from the Amoraic period. In other words, we're talking about the 3rd and the 4th centuries, Laminyanam. In Eretz Yisrael, they were also widely used, but none of these received the same kind of haskama, the seal of approval, as the Targum of Onkelos. And even in the academic world, the Targum Onkelos is considered to be very ancient. That it was probably originally, in other words, the various academicians who have looked into this also conclude that it is very ancient. Some of them talk about the 2nd century, but even that doesn't. I don't think that in any way really contradicts anything that we've seen here, because as we said, the Targum of Onkelos, it says in the Talmud, Bavli Megillah Daf Gimel, Amaro, not Ketavo, Amaro. He composed it, and it was studied and learned Ba'al Peh, just like the Mishnah was learned Ba'al Peh. But the Mishnah also was not written at that time, was not committed to writing. It was only from the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi onwards, in other words, approximately 100 or so years later, a bit more even, 130 years later, that the Torah Ba'al Peh, the oral traditions, were slowly and reluctantly committed to writing. So the Mishnah, and one can assume, I do assume that at this time the Targum of Onkelos was also committed to writing, and in Eretz Yisrael, and then it made its way to Bavel, and there it also underwent certain redactions and perhaps changes of style to take into account the fact that there are differences between the Aramaic of Eretz Yisrael and the Aramaic of Bavel, Eastern Aramaic as opposed to Western Aramaic dialect. But the backbone and the essential methodology of the Targum Onkelos, I think we can certainly accept and should accept, exactly as it is stated in both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, that this was already known and placed before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, before the Hurban, and they praised it very highly and gave it their seal of approval. And then it began to be disseminated and began to become more and more common and was studied and recited Ba'al Peh Mamash. And then later was committed to writing. Later, as we said, just as the Mishnah was committed to writing. In other words, those things that had been Ba'al Peh became eventually Bichtav, not because it should be that way, not because it's ideal that it be that way, but as Rashi says in Masechet Bava Masiah, that at the end of Perek, at the end of Elu Masiot, Rashi says that the Mishnah and the Talmud and all these things were not committed to writing, and only in our time, Rashi says. In other words, Bedorothenu, Rashi says, Bedorothenu, in recent generations, the Talmud was committed to writing. The Mishnah was committed to writing earlier, but the discussions on the Mishnah were not yet committed to writing. So says Rashi in the Vamasiyah. In other words, there was this evolutionary process of things being entirely Ba'al Peh. Eventually, some things were committed to writing because of the very real hashash that things would be forgotten they probably saw that more and more mistakes were creeping into the text, and this process had to be arrested. And later, other texts like the Talmud also eventually were no longer committed only to memory, but also to writing. And one of the proofs that Shadal brings for the time period in which Targum Onkelos was written, he brings, other than the proofs that we just mentioned, after all, the text that we just saw in both Talmudim state that it was this Targum came into existence already in the time of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, which means when the Mikdash was still standing. But beyond that, he brings several examples where Shadal shows that one of the things that Onkelos did in his Targum was to introduce certain essential halachot that people needed to know. When they were to hear the Targum in Aramaic, they needed to know the drasha, which is halakha ma'aseh of the Hachamim. So therefore, he added certain words or certain concepts to the Targum beyond that which is written in the Torah, the text of the Torah itself. One such example is in Vayikra Perek Zayin, Pasuk Yod Tef. So we're beginning now Sefer Vayikra. So this is something that we'll come across before too long. The pasuk in Vayikra, this is Parashat So, according to the annual cycle. Perek Zayin pasuk Yod Tet. It says, "V'habasar asher yiga' b'chol tomeh lo ya'achel, v'esh yisaref, v'habasar kol tahor yochal basar." We're talking about Zebach Shulamim, as you see in the previous pasuk. So the korban, the basar, the meat of the korban which is eaten, the basar kol tahor yochal basar. What does it say in the Targum Onkelos? It says uvsar kudsha, meat of a korban which is kodesh, which is referred to as kodesh. Kol de yivke lekudsha yechol basar kudsha. You see clearly that Onkelos is introducing words and ideas that are not in the original text. It says kol tahor yochal basar. So if a person was tovel, a kohen was tovel to eat teruma, but we know from the halakha in Masechet Hagigah that if you were tovel to eat teruma, that's not sufficient to eat kodesh, to eat basar zevach hashlamim. You have to be tovel again. In other words, you have to be mechawen, to be tahor for the particular thing that you are going to partake of. This is mentioned in as we said, this is mentioned in Hagigah, in the Talmud Bavli, in the Mishnah, Staf Yud Het Amud Bet, Bigdei Ochlet Teruma Midras LaKodesh. In other words, even though a person is tahor to eat teruma, he's not able yet to eat kodesh. He has to go through the act of tahara once again to eat from the kodesh, from the basara kodesh, from the korban. So Onkelos is very precise, and he says, "Uvsar kudsha, kol deyivke lekudsha." He who has made himself tahor dafka lekudsha, he yechol basar kudsha. He may eat from the basara kodesh, but not someone else, even though they're tahor be'etzim. So this is, what do we see here, says the Shadda? We see here an example of a practical halachic instruction, which is introduced based on an ancient statement in drasha of Torah Ba'al Peh, which Onkelos learnt from Rabban Gamliel and from other Chachamim in his time. He was aware of this halacha, even though it's not written in the Torah, even though this is Midivrei Soferim, this is not min HaTorah. It's clear that the ma'ala that is required to eat kodesh, as opposed to eating teruma, is midivrei soferim. as all those statements over there in Masechet Haricha are with Divrei Soferim. Nevertheless, because this is a halacha lema'aseh, because the mikdash is still standing and there are still korbanot, people have to know the halacha lema'aseh, and they cannot be misled by a Targum which doesn't stress this point. So therefore, he introduces this drasha in those few words into the Targum. From this is one example where from which Shadal wishes to prove and to show that Onkelos would not have gone to such lengths if we were talking about a Hilchatara Mashiach, about something that was only relevant in some distant future time. But in his own day, it was not halacha ma'aseh. He wouldn't go into such a detail. But because the Mikdash was still standing and there was still korbanot, this is something that people had to know. So I will end with those thoughts regarding the very ancient provenance of the Targum Onkelos and how it is so authoritative, how it was praised and given a seal of approval by the greatest Hachamim of the generation of Tanaim when the Mikdash was still standing. There is, of course, much more than can be said about Targum Onkelos, but just these few comments should suffice to instill in us the clear perception and understanding that this Targum of Onkelos is of tremendous importance, and is something that we ignore and do not learn at our own peril. It is very important that we do so, and studying the Torah in this triennial cycle, where the weekly portion is much shorter, allows us to read each pasuk and take it in, and read the Targum and understand it and take it in. And I know that not everyone is familiar with the Lashon of the Targum yet, but there are many aids which we have today. There is a book called Yen Hatov, which helps explain some of the more difficult or less common words in Targum Onkelos, and also in Targum attributed to Yonatan ben Uziel. In other words, another ancient Targum. There's a book called Yen Hatov. There is a book called Nathina Lager on the Targum Onkelos, which is of great value, written by Rav Nathan Adler. Brief and very illuminating. There is also Targum Avraham, written by the son of the Gra, which is a very fascinating book, where he basically shows the correlation and the similarity of Lashon HaKodesh and Aramith, and by just pointing out a word that appears in the Targum that actually appears in a Hebrew pasuk in somewhere else in the Tanakh. Elsewhere, that itself is a kind of perush on the Targum itself and explains the intention of the Targum. And there is, as I said, this amazing Sefer called Ohev Ger by the Shadal, and I'm happy to send it to those who wish. It is full of Shinoi Nushaot on the Targum, although it has to be pointed out that Shadal was not able, he was not zoche to see the Temani manuscripts of the Targum that we have, but he searched for and found almost everything else of value and of importance with regards to the Targum. He relates in his book how he found literally in the Gniza, in the Bet Knesset in Italy, he found a book written in the 15th century by an anonymous author who had written a perush on the whole Targum, and he literally saved it from disappearing, and he quotes it frequently in his own book Ohev Ger. So I encourage everyone to study the Torah in depth, to be able to study without feeling undue pressure to cover a huge amount without really being able to understand and to focus properly, and to place to emphasize and give center stage to the Targum. And from that, Mimela, one immediately can look at Rashi and look at the Ramban and others. They also always refer, very frequently, they refer to the Targum also. And these by doing so, our understanding of the Torah will expand exponentially, Be'ezrat Hashem. So he's cool. V'yames levavchem kol ha'miyahalim l'Adonai. And one more pasuk I wish to quote from Sefer Tehillim, the end of Perek Sodeh. V'hi no'am Adonai Elohenu alenu u'ma'aseh yodenu konenu alenu u'ma'aseh yodenu konenehu. Hazak u'baruch to you all, and particularly to Yedidenu Hadagul Rabbi Gavriel, for being really the driving force behind getting us all to begin to take note of these things and to place our study of the Torah on a much higher and more meaningful plane. Adka.
Kavod Rav, thank you for those remarks as well as the whole shiur. Okay, I'll briefly. Josh, you said at the beginning that the Triennial Cycle, which itself is a slightly inappropriate word. We don't have a better one, but if it's taken to imply that there's something special about 3 years or 3.5 years or 3.25 years, that's not correct. The basic point is that Chazal set originally, or you might even say pre-Chazal, the Chachamim of the Dor of Ezra Sofer set a certain amount of Torah to read each week, based upon how much people can be expected to read and internalize and understand. And it falls out that if you read that much, it comes out about 3 years. And if you take, and depending on when Shabbos falls on Yom Tov, and if Rosh Chodesh is this, blah, 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 it might be a bit more, it might be a bit less. You can divide up a bit more, you can divide up a bit less. There's nothing special about 3.5 years, or 3 years, in fact. But there's one more thing, which is that it's very true, of course, that it was established by the Chachamim of Eretz Israel, but that shouldn't be taken to imply that it's only for Eretz Israel, or it's specifically for Eretz Israel. When Chazal established this reading, their assumption, as far as anyone knows, and there's no reason to think otherwise, was Jews, wherever they should be, if unfortunately for whatever reason they're not home in Eretz Israel, should also be reading a Triennial Cycle. And you could even argue that one of the benefits of a Triennial Cycle, which is that it allows you to study a more manageable portion each week, is even more relevant to those of you who, for the time being, are not here, because the timetable for the annual cycle is even more cramped in Chutz La'aretz because of having more Yom Tovs that fall, as a rule, not always, but as a rule, having more Yom Tovs that fall on Shabbos than we do here. But the point I'm getting at is that there's a distinction that everyone knows. There are halachot for people who live in Chutz La'aretz and halachot for people who live here in Eretz Israel. But that is not the same thing as the distinction between Torath Eretz Israel and Torath Bavel. The distinction between living here and living somewhere else exists in both of them and exists in a different way than both of them. And unfortunately, the reality is that as Jews have come back home, in very many cases, though they have adopted halachot of Eretz Israel, what they've been bringing back is davka, the Torah of Bavel, and not the Torah of Eretz Israel. It's a very good example. We all just had this sukkos, which is tefillin on Chol HaMoed. All the sources from Eretz Israel say you're supposed to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. They either imply it very strongly, or they say so explicitly, like the Yerushalmi. And it's only in Bavel, I mean, the Bavli doesn't say anything, but it's only in Bavel that this idea that you shouldn't even arose. And it was in Spain that it seems to become more common in certain quarters and eventually gets written into the Zohar, etc., etc. The point is, the opinion that you should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed is Davka, one section of a Bavli opinion. It's Davka, not an Eretz Yisrael opinion. Unfortunately, what you'll be told nowadays is that if you were living in France, okay, maybe you can put on tefillin without a bracha or something. But here in Eretz Yisrael, the minhag is not to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So you have here a clear example of people coming back to Eretz Yisrael and Davka doing hafuch from Torah Eretz Yisrael. Another little example is related to what we're talking about here. Is the Mishnah says, "B'Yom Tov Rishon Shel Hag Korim Parshas Moedos Shel Toras Kohanim." You read from what is called Parshas Emor, according to the Bavli cycle. Uvish'ar Yom HaHag b'Korbanos HaHag, and on every other day of the Chag, you read the Korbanot of that day of Chag. And as the Tosefta explains, that means on day 2 you read Uviyom HaSheni, and on day 3 you read Uviyom HaShlishi, and on day 8, Shmini Atzeret, you read Uviyom HaShmini, and that's also what the Yerushalmi says. Come the Bavli says, no, on Shmini Atzeret, this is already an interesting thing. It says, on Shmini Atzeret, you should read Kol HaBachor, which is the end of what is known as Parshat Re'eh. And then here, because we have 2 days Yom Tov, you read, on the second day, you read the Zot HaBracha, which obviously is based upon the practice that had already become prevalent in Bavel by that point of finishing and then also starting the Torah at on the second day of Shmini Atzeret. And then subsequently, this whole festival of Simchat Torah, you start seeing certain parts of it in the Gaonim, and then later on, more and more practices get introduced, and then this idea comes that even though the Mishnah says you're not allowed to dance on Yom Tov, you are allowed to dance on this Yom Tov. And all sorts of very, just objectively quite strange things happen, that, an ordinary person on Simchat Torah gets home at night, I don't know, many, many hours after you normally get back on Yom Tov, and you have some very truncated, unless you're super from, you have some very truncated Su'udah, and then you go straight to bed, so you can get up in the morning to do more dancing, which also the Chor is Asa, whatever. Anyway, the point is that, I'm not saying there aren't Heterim, but it's a strange thing. And what happened when Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael? Well, in Chutz La'aretz, they had Shmini Atzeret, which was a normal Yom Tov, and they had Simchat Torah, which was this kind of a bit of a strange Yom Tov. And I don't think it takes, you don't take a genius to work out what's going on here. 2-day Yom Tov is not the easiest thing to do. It's especially not the easiest thing to do when you just did it for Rosh Hashanah, and then you did it for Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag, and now it's Shmini Atzeret. And people, everyone will admit this if they're honest, they get a bit bored. And so Simchat Torah kind of basically developed as something to do on day 9. But now, of course, that need is not there. There's nothing hard about keeping 1 day Yom Tov, but no one even the word Shmini Atzeret is kind of, that's what you say in the davening on Simchat Torah, right? So what has happened is this Davka festival of Galut, of Bavel, and of the subsequent kind of post-Bavel tradition has become, what do you do in Eretz Yisrael? In Eretz Yisrael, you don't have Shmini Atzeret, you only have Simchat Torah. And you could pile example upon example. And so to cap that off, in these circles, it's not a controversial thing to say the Bet HaMikdash is not going to fall from the sky. You're already sold on that one. And I agree. But Torah Eretz Yisrael is also not going to fall from the sky. The fact that Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael, and the minority of them that kept the Torah Bichlal, Davka kept the Torah of Galuth, and are not interested in exchanging it for the Torah of Eretz Yisrael, is a reality. There's not going to be some sort of awakening that just happens, boom, from the sky. There very well may be, unfortunately, but it seems quite likely, a kind of a lot of falling off from certain sections of the Haredi world and certain sections of the Dati Le'umi world. And if you've got a safety net ready to catch them, you might be in a position to catch them. But the basic point is that Torah Eretz Yisrael is not going to come, it's not going to shoot out of the ground, it's not going to fall from the sky. It's only going to happen if you make it happen. And apart from every other reason why studying the Triennial Cycle is a beautiful thing, because it allows you to study Targum properly, because it allows you to study the Parsha properly, because it allows you to lane your own Parsha if you have it in shul. It makes it a realistic thing to do the normal, obvious thing, which is everyone gets up and lanes their own Pesukim instead of standing there while someone else lanes their Pesukim and maybe trying to whisper it along with them, but not too loud because then you put them off, etc. Apart from all these other reasons why it's a beautiful thing to do the Triennial Cycle, it's also a nice, concrete thing where you can say, this is something I do as part of Torah Eretz Yisrael. And I do it with my Chabura, or I do it with my Chevrusa, or Im Yitz Hashem soon, I do it with my shul. And Baruch Hashem, we were talking earlier on WhatsApp about setting up in Yerushalayim, a Chabura dedicated to the Triennial Cycle. Go do it, set it up. No one's going to do this if you don't do it. And if you don't do it, then I don't know what's going to be. So do it. That's all else.
Hazaku Baruch.
Hazaku Baruch. Thank you, Harav. Thank you, Gabriel. Good evening, everyone.
So what else is there to say after such admonitions and words of encouragement? You have to be. The British might use the term a mug, not to actually take it upon yourself to begin this. If you haven't already begun, and if you have begun, to continue. B'yeter sa'eth, b'yeter oz, to study the Torah. In general, the Torah is there for all to be studied, right? It's not like merucha or kehuna, as we know. Torah munahat ifnei chulam. It's there for all to learn, for all to study. Ta'amu u're'u ki tov Hashem. Hayu beruchim.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.